the final implication for this study of near-death experiences has to do with mental health care. I mean, especially if near-death experiences are caused by human physiology, caused by a protein, a gene, a molecule, whatever. If we could figure out how these experiences are caused, the physiology of them, we can then apply this, at least in theory, to those who have mental health issues. So just take a step back for a second, we'll get into this, but near-death experiences, those who have experienced near-death experiences have had life-changing epiphanies, and they're generally very, very positive. I mean, they come from they talk about experiencing this great love, and they bring this back to them, and they want to tell everyone about this great love that they call God or the light, whatever. But it makes them very, very positive, and it changes their life in many cases, or at least in the cases that we know of, where persons have committed suicide and they've had this near-death experience and they've come back after encountering this divine being, this loving being. I mean, they change their lives. They no longer want to commit suicide. Interesting enough, persons who've committed suicide and have had these experiences, although they value the experience, I mean, they recognize the tragedy of suicide, and many of them become advocates for mental health and helping those that are considering suicide. So if we could figure out how this works in the brain, how these things happen, the implication is we could apply this to persons who are mentally ill or clinically depressed and create these experiences for them. All right, so what is a near-death experience? Now, interesting enough, it's pretty difficult to define. The definition that I'm going to use in this course, and I'll mention that there are many definitions by a variety of scholars in this field, but the definition that I want to use is taken from Dr. Moody as well as Dr. Long, and they describe a near-death experience as events that take place as a person is dying or indeed is already clinically dead. Note, most of the experiences that you've probably heard about in popular media, when we talk about these different studies that have been done on persons who've had near-death experiences, generally done on persons who've had cardiac arrest, and there's a variety of reasons. One of which is, in these instances, the heart is stopped and the brain is flatlined, or brain death has occurred. There's no more oxygen, to the brain, and that's definitive. We have evidence for this. But nevertheless, near-death experiences occur not necessarily within the hospital or cardiac arrest. We have many cases of people who are about to be involved in a life-threatening situation. In one instance, there was a blind woman that was involved in a car wreck. And what she said is the experience occurred right before the wreck happened. Okay, so life-threatening situation, but she was not dead yet, which is why that definition. And if you want to create your own definition of near-death experience, it has to take into account the variety of experiences. Now, a near-death experience usually includes one of at least 12 of the characteristics that I have listed here. Number one, heightened senses. So people that have these experiences, let's take the case of a cardiac a patient with whose heart is stopped, who has been brain dead. They'll talk about having these heightened senses, so seeing clearly, more clearly than they've ever seen before, the ability to listen or to hear things more intensely. Intense and gradual positive emotions or feelings. So generally speaking, the vast majority of near-death experiences will talk about a very positive experience, this being encountered by this positivity. They usually define as love. The most common definition of this positive experience is love, as well as And I think second to love would be peace, and the third would probably be joy. Passing through a tunnel. So again, I'm giving you these 12 common experiences, but just note that not everyone who's had a near-death experience has had a whole 12 of these. They might only have a few of them. Passing through a tunnel. This is probably the most famous near-death experience, where the person sees this actual tunnel, and there's a light at the end of it, and they pass through it. It kind of reminds me of, if you remember from Tibetan Buddhism, this light, right? You see this light, and you pass through this tunnel to get to the light. Encountering a mystical or brilliant light, very, very common experience. Light. A Christian might describe this as the glory of God. Encountering other beings. In many cases, the being that is encountered, this light, is God. We'll call this God. They'll also, and if you're a Christian, you most likely will call this Jesus, maybe the Mother of God. If you're a Muslim, you'll most likely call this an angel. If you're a Hindu, you'll most likely call this the personal deity you're devoted to. But most common, the most common experience is not a religious figure, but actually your family. And we'll come back to this. So many people report to encounter dead relatives, and so the classic example is someone who encounters a grandmother, and usually the relatives, they'll know the relatives are, but they'll be much younger. So if it's someone who died when they're 95 years old, they'll see them as a 30-year-old adult. There's one instance where a mother claims to have had this experience, and she encountered this woman that she knew to be her daughter. Now her daughter died as a young child, but here she was, a grown-up, beautiful, young woman, speaking with her. Sense of an alteration of time or space, so a lot of near-death experiences will describe their experience as kind of, being outside of time. They'll talk about their experience as being a very long experience, but when they come back to their bodies, they recognize maybe they've only been out for 3 minutes, but it's felt like 3 hours. There's also a lot of near-death experiencers. They'll talk about the ability to really transcend the space-time continuum, or just three-dimensional space as we know it. So I have to walk out of my door to get out of my door. What they talk about is the ability just to kind of think and move, right? To be across the universe in split seconds. All kinds of crazy, interesting things. The life review. Now, if you recall, in Judaism, this is a part of that tradition, or at least one of the afterlife traditions, seeing your life review. Now, I was watching TV the other day, and there's this commercial for Catholics Come Home. I don't know if you've seen this, but pay attention if you do see it. In this one commercial, there's this person or persons that come into a room. It's like they're in front of a big screen, and they watch their life. And it's a traumatic experience because they've done some crappy things. They've done great things too. Now, when we look at the life review, it's kind of like that. People who describe it, they'll describe it as standing with this being, normally your deity, God, Jesus, whomever, and seeing your life flash before your eyes. But also, interesting enough, it's described as not simply just watching your life, but watching it from a different perspective. So you're not watching it from, you're not reliving it. You're seeing what you did, and you also get to see what you did from the vantage point of those whom you've hurt. So think about that. Think about that next time you want to do something negative to another person. And interesting enough, when I was reading these accounts of the life review, immediately, for some reason, I just kept thinking about Catholic purgatory. It's a purging experience. This is some of the vocabulary that persons have used, and it can be a very painful experience because you're watching your life before your eyes, and you're seeing the way you've treated people. And if you've done good things throughout your life, well, then it's kind of like a job well done, a pat on the back. But if you haven't, it can be quite painful. And in many instances, persons are kind of returned to their bodies after this life review to do more good with their lives. Encountering heavy realms. So in many instances, we'll talk about heaven. And interesting enough, heaven is, of course, a very beautiful place. Garden, whatever. I mean, gorgeous place. A lot of persons will use the term ineffable, meaning that it's beyond anything you can experience. So think back to that lecture on Christianity. I talked briefly about the analogy of being. We're talking about these realms that there's just no analogy in the human language for it. And I think that's an accurate depiction of the majority of persons who've had this experience of this heavenly realm. Some also come back with special knowledge. So maybe in some really interesting instances, there are persons who've come back with foresight. Who have made predictions about things that will occur in the future or with their family. There's some instances where people will come back and say, so and so will die or has died, et cetera, et cetera. In many cases, the special knowledge is simply that God is love, and we are put on earth to love. Encountering a boundary or barrier between this world and the next. So a lot of persons who've had near-death experiences, they'll talk about coming to almost like a wall or almost like a glass pane where they could see their loved ones and relatives on the other side. But they know in their heart of hearts that if they cross, there's no coming back to earth. And what's really interesting is people who've had these positive, and most near-death experiences are positive, they don't want to come back to life, right? And many of whom decide to, they do so because either a relative or a religious figure has said they have more work to do, or that they feel especially in cases where they have young children, they want to come home to take care of their family and children. Return to the body. And then finally, this out-of-body experience. We'll talk more about this, and this is abbreviated as OBE. This is really interesting because there have been quite a few studies that have looked at the accuracy of these out-of-body experiences. In many cases, persons who have these experiences will talk about coming out of their body and hovering. Let's take the classic example of cardiac arrest, where they're hovering above their body and they're seeing the doctors, working on their body and trying to resuscitate their body. If you're interested in learning more about these first-hand accounts of near-death experiences, at the bottom I have a little link there to the NDE RF website, and this is the largest database of personal accounts of near-death experiences from near-death experiencers. And we'll talk about Dr. Long and his study of these accounts. In fact, the 12 points that I brought up here are from the study that was done based on this database a few years ago. Now, interesting enough, when we talk about near-death experiences, although these have become really almost a part of our culture, I think most of you have probably heard of near-death experiences. You probably already have an opinion about it. You would think they're nonsense. You think they're evidence of heaven, hell, whatever. But this, I just pay attention. This is not a new phenomenon. This image I have here in my present, this is a painting that was made in the 16th century. And when we look back to personal journals, personal accounts of those who have come back from dying, they don't use the terminology near-death experience. That term, was originated by Dr. Moody. He created that term in the 70s. But when we look at what exactly is happening in near-death experience, and this has been something that's people have been talking about for centuries. And it has made its way into many of our major religious traditions. Note that, especially when we get to the Christian tradition, without a doubt, you'll see this imagery there. You don't see a lot of teaching on this because in Christianity, the stress isn't that process as it is in Tibetan Buddhism. It's not on the process of going to heaven, hell, or purgatory. It's on the state of heaven, hell, or purgatory. So you don't see a lot of literature there. But nevertheless, it's cross-cultural, and it is something that's been around for quite a few times. It's not a new phenomenon. The terminology is new. The experience is not. So, from a clinical perspective, how do you differentiate between a hallucination, maybe wishful thinking, and a near-death experience? And there have been a lot of scholars who've tried to do so. And one of the scales that is used by scientists who are performing studies on near-death experiencers is the Grayson scale. And the Grayson scale, I have it listed here, has 16 features, much like the 12 that I just explained of near-death experiences. And basically what happens, the attending physician or scholar or scientist, they'll give a score of 0 to 2 for each of these experiences. 0 is no experience of each of these characteristics, 1 is experience, and 2 is an intense experience. And in order for it to classify as a near-death experience, you must have at least a score of 7. So you would need a minimum, 4 of these as an intense experience. The studies that we'll look at briefly today, they use the Grayson scale. Just be aware of that. So let's look at the research on near-death experience. I mentioned Dr. Ray Moody. He's really the father of near-death experiences, and at least the scientific study of it. His book, Life After Life, in 1972, was the first major publication on this topic. And in fact, the video that you watched is itself based upon this book. And since then, since 1972, we've had several decades of research on near-death experiences. Now, in the popular media, most of you are probably familiar with some of these arguments. You have 3 voices that dominate. The first are the paranormalists, and they're going to argue that near-death experiences prove the afterlife. Many of them, fortunately or unfortunately, are cashing in on their personal near-death experiences by the books they're writing or the movies that they're producing. Take that as you will. But just be aware of that. So the paranormalists. The second is the skeptic, because they're also cashing in on, denying the existence of the world outside of ourselves, or the existence of anything outside of the material realm. And of course, they're going to argue that either near-death experiences are fabricated or they're the result of physiological process. And then finally, the fundamentalists, and especially in other parts of the country, you'll find a very clear argument made by this group. And what they would argue is these experiences are true, but they're of course of demonic origin. So just be aware of that. Nevertheless, in recent years, we've seen scientific studies of near-death experiences. 2 of which, and I have a few of them listed here, and there are many. And these are probably the most well-known studies to date. And if you have a chance, go through them if you're interested in this topic. Dr. Long, I already mentioned, his Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, which had the largest database of personal accounts, examined these accounts, and he made some pretty important conclusions and created some very influential and important scholarship on near-death experiences, because unlike others before him that have looked at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 near-death experiences, and he looked at 1,600 cases. And he was able to make some pretty remarkable conclusions. The second study that I'll be dealing with today is real recent. It's 2005. It was just published in October 2014 in the journal Resuscitation. It's this awareness study led by this Dr. Parnia. It involved over 2,000 cardiac patients in over 15 hospitals. And the study itself was aimed not only to look at what a near-death experience is, how often it occurs, but more importantly to test out out-of-body experience. And we'll talk about what he found with regard to out-of-body experiences. So all this research, we do have a couple of important conclusions thus far. Number one, 1 out of 5 persons facing deadly situations will have a near-death experience. 10% of cardiac arrest patients have near-death experiences, and again, 4 to 8% of the total population of the U.S. have had a near-death experience. These experiences occur irrespective of age, ethnicity, culture, and religion. Interestingly, and this has been made evident, particularly in Dr. Long's study, the near-death experiences are across culture. Near-death experiences share the same content. And be careful with this. If you look at those 12 points I outlined at the beginning of this lecture, or the 16 points of the Grayson scale, what you'll see is people claiming to have near-death experiences, be it Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jew, atheist, agnostic, whatever, they're going to have the same content. They're going to see the light. They're going to have these experiences of positivity, etc., etc. Meeting this being, seeing family members. Nevertheless, how they interpret this experience will vary. So, for instance, Christians, when they meet a divine figure, guess who it is? Jesus. Hindus, when they meet a divine figure, guess who they interpret it as? Well, their personal deity, Vishnu, Krishna, whomever. Muslims, when they experience a divine being, most likely an angel. When they experience the light, if you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, you'll call that God, and you'll call that a loving God, Allah, whomever. If you're a Hindu, you might call that Brahman Atman. Secondly, children have the same experience as adults, and this is important. We actually have one case, at least, where the youngest person to ever have had a near-death experience was 6 months old, and this was a really interesting study. This child, throughout his early life, would have panic attacks when entering into tunnels, right? And the parents just thought it was the strangest thing. They couldn't figure it out. So when the child was about 4 years old, the parents, so in the back of their mind, the child was having these panic attacks. Now, I should also mention, at the age of 6 months, the child almost died, and when it was resuscitated, so obviously he was in good health afterwards. But nevertheless, he had these panic attacks over tunnel experiences. So when he was 4 years old, around 4 years old, the parents had to explain to the child that the beloved grandfather, was dying. And so as they were explaining, the child said to them, "Oh, I know what death is. I died, in fact." And he started explaining this tunnel experience, and the attending psychiatrist was able to connect the tunnel experience panic attacks with this near-death experience. But nevertheless, children are having these same experiences as adults. So the argument that these experiences are simply caused by the popularity of them in cultures, or especially in the U.S., some skeptics call it the Oprah factor. Oprah's popularized, has been a strong force behind the marketability of near-death experiences. Nevertheless, children who are not aware of this research, or Oprah, who have little knowledge of what death is, lack an ability to explain, or maturity to explain death, are having having near-death experiences. These experiences are very lucid, very clear, which is strange, because if the person is dying and there's a lack of oxygen to the brain, especially if the person's under anesthesia, they should have little or no memory, or that memory, should be dreamlike, much more of a vague and cloudy dream. But this isn't the case. And we also talk about this perfect playback. There have been studies that have looked at persons who have, on record, explained their experience, and then several decades later, they've tested them again to see if it was consistent, and they found, remarkably, these stories are consistent. And why is that important? Well, just think about that. If you're telling me a story, if I were telling you a story about my personal life now, chances are 10 years from now it might change a little bit, because of my memory isn't that good. I forget things, or we have a tendency as just human beings to exaggerate a little bit. Kind of like the big fish story. But with near-death experiences, that does not seem to be the case. Let's move to out-of-body experience. Now, out-of-body experience is really important for the study of near-death experiences. And the reason is, this is the one characteristic of near-death experiences that we can actually test. Like, so how do you test someone meeting Jesus? How do you test someone meeting a bright light love tunnel? Can you test that? It doesn't seem like you can. You can look at to see if they're consistent. You can see if they have good mental health. If they're known for their honesty, etc., etc. But you can't really perform a test that is going to convince others that this experience was authentic. Now, out-of-body experiences is a little different, because out-of-body experiences, people are claiming, especially in the case of a hospital, to hover above their body and to see exactly what's going on, including the conversations. So there have been a few studies that have actually tried to test this, one of which is by Dr. Pernia, the awareness study that I mentioned in 2014. And you can look this up if you're interested. But what he found out was, number one, out of the 2,000 patients he studied, and out of the patients that actually lived through or survived their cardiac arrest, what he found out was 2% of them had out-of-body experiences. And at least in one instance, that person who had an out-of-body experience was able to explain in vivid detail what exactly happened to his body and what exactly the attending physicians and nurses were doing in the room as he flatlined. How did he get this knowledge? Well, based upon this study, there was no other way for him to get this knowledge, either to have been told it, by a physician there, or to have been out of body. And so, at least in this study, it gives some good evidence that this person recalled the events accurately, and the events are documented. So at least in this case, it does give good evidence that this person had an authentic, out-of-body experience. Now, is this proof of the afterlife? Well, that might be a different question. Negative near-death experiences. So we've talked a lot about positive near-death experiences, and the vast majority of them are positive, but there are negative near-death experiences. In fact, there have been a few studies on them, and we think about 1 to 5% of all near-death experiences are negative. Really interesting, most of the negative near-death experiences that have been documented are from non-Western persons. Hindus, Buddhists, persons follows their ancestral religions. So why is that? Well, there's a variety of theories for it. One of which is that, especially here in the West, we're not really comfortable talking about heaven, hell, and damnation. So those numbers, 1 to 5%, might be skewed because people who are having these negative experiences are most likely not going to talk about them because, if you're seeing images of hell, that's generally not a good thing, right? It probably means that you haven't been a very good person, at least within a Judeo-Christian, context. Nevertheless, when we get to negative near-death experiences, there are two common characteristics, one of which is an experience of being alone or void. Now, my father, about 2 years ago, his heart stopped, and he was, clinically dead. And then, of course, he was resuscitated, and thank God he's okay now. But he had a negative near-death experience. He doesn't really talk about it too much, but I got him to talk about it once, and he described it as nothing, right? being conscious of utter nothingness, complete aloneness, no image, complete darkness, just being conscious of utter nothingness. It's scared the daylights out of them. That's a very common experience for near-death experiencers who've had negative experiences. The second, which is generally less common, is the experience of what we'd call hell, or this negative underworld. People who've had the experience talk about hellish creatures, foreboding landscapes, demons. In one instance, by a Buddhist woman, she was speaking about this dark cloud, and on the dark cloud were these suffering people, and she was telling them to chant this sutra to the Buddha to be liberated from their suffering. But again, not a fun place. This is not the majority, but just be aware that there are negative near-death experiences documented. All right, so how do you explain near-death experiences? Is there an explanation? Now, to date, there are three main explanations. First is the dying brain theory. Second, depersonalization theories. And third, the transcendental theories. Now, I want to stress that these aren't the only theories out there. There are actually many theories. The transcendental theorists, those who support that near-death experiences are evidence that we have an afterlife, that God exists, that the soul exists, will point to the fact that there is no consensus among scholars on how to explain near-death experiences from a physiological or psychological point of view, as evidence that the only reasonable explanation is that there is an afterlife. And we'll get into that. So there are a variety of experiences and a variety of explanations, but what I want to look at today, right now, are the main arguments made. So let's look at the dying brain theories. One of the leading scholars who have published quite a bit on this topic is Dr. Blackmore. And what he argues is that the near-death experience is caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain when the brain is dying. And so he's looking primarily at patients who have had or undergone cardiac arrest. What he argues is that the lack of oxygen to the brain activates cells in the back of the brain that could possibly create the illusion that there is a light in the periphery, right? Which kind of will give credence to this experience of a tunnel and having a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, in defense of his position, there is something called a G-lock phenomenon, and this has been observed with high-speed test pilots. So, when high-speed test pilots, they're traveling really, really fast, and when they make quick maneuvers, the G-force, the forces on their body are so powerful that it actually slows down the blood flow, from their heart to the brain, and the effect that they have said includes a feeling of euphoria, which you might interpret as a positive feeling, as well as a dream-like experience. Generally positive, but kind of like a dreamy state. Dr. Madua, and there have been quite a few studies recently that have also taken up this argument, has said, well, no, that's not oxygen that may be the cause of NDEs, but rather carbon dioxide. In his studies, he found that carbon dioxide also led to this dream-like experience. In a 2010 study of 52 patients that were that were resuscitated after heart failure, they found out that 11 of those 52 had a near-death experience. When they tested those 11, they also found that they had high levels of carbon dioxide. And the implication is that the higher levels of carbon dioxide led to the near-death experience. Nevertheless, there are a few problems with this theory. Number one, low levels of oxygen or excessive carbon dioxide are actually relatively common. yet near-death experiences are not. You would think that if lack of oxygen or an increase in carbon dioxide as the brain is dying was the cause of near-death experiences, then the majority of people who are dying due to either and who have these symptoms should be having near-death experiences. But when we look at who's having it, I mean, again, maybe as high as 10%, as low as 4% is not the majority. Secondly, when you look at the explanations of these theories, notice this dreamlike state being used, the term dreamlike or the adjective dreamlike. And in the case of Dr. Blackmore, he talks about this light and the kind of like a fading light in the periphery. When we examine the accounts of near-death experiencers, what they're saying is very different from these explanations. They're talking about very vivid imagery, meeting persons. And again, the tunnel experience itself, at least based on Dr. Long's research, is only experienced by 30% of persons that have had a near-death experience. So it's by no means the majority. So when I explain all the other aspects of near-death experience, and again, no near-death experiences are not arguing they're having a dreamlike kind of fuzzy image, but rather these vivid, and some of the language that's used, the most vivid experience they've ever had in their entire lives. Third, both of these theories, they're implied by other studies, but they have yet to have been proven by actual studies that have looked on the effects of oxygen depletion or excessive carbon dioxide on the brain with respect to near-death experiences. Fourth, it also doesn't explain, both these theories do not explain all the people who have had near-death experiences before they've died or before their heart has stopped. So think of a person in a car wreck. In some cases, persons can have near-death experiences while being very much alive. You don't have to have brain death for a near-death experience. That itself is a misnomer. Fifth, in cases where brain death is documented, no thought should be occurring, and certainly no memory should be retained, but yet this is happening. And again, these people are talking about this experience being the most vivid experience of their life. Sixth, especially in cases where anesthesia is used, there shouldn't be any memory. The whole point of anesthesia is to cause amnesia, so that you do not remember the experience. Yet, not only are these experiences recalled, but they're very vivid. Okay. The second explanation is a depersonalization theory, and basically this is a psychological theory. Now, the main scholar behind this is, one of the leading scholars behind this theory is Dr. Owens. And depersonalization refers to a process by which a patient creates a surreal environment that is disconnected from a trauma of dying. So it's basically an unconscious defense mechanism. So this has been observed in cases, in traumatic events, where people create an alternate explanation or alternate reality that is radically different from the reality of their experience. So it's just a way that our psyche deals with traumatic events. And the argument is, of course, that the near-death experience is an example of depersonalization. These persons that are experiencing these horrible traumatic events, I know that their psyche is kicking in and creating these dreamlike, beautiful events to kind of to do away with the trauma of that experience. Scholars who purport this will also argue, especially with respect to out-of-body experience, that perhaps the person isn't completely dead, and that person is conscious of what's going on, hearing what's going on, and this experience that they're fabricating incorporates what they're hearing, as well as their other experiences with respect to, seeing, maybe being in the hospital before, or seeing shows like Grey's Anatomy, where you see people, you have an idea of what happens when someone is being resuscitated. Nevertheless, as it stands, this is simply a theory. It hasn't been tested. It's simply just a theory that's been proposed. It also cannot explain the consistency of near-death experiences. So one argument used against this is, wait a minute, if this is the case, then you should expect near-death experiences to be very, very different across cultures. Heck, across persons. Because I should be creating an experience that I find, pleasing, that should be radically different than, someone from a different perspective that doesn't share the same views of the afterlife that I do. Yet this isn't the case. It also doesn't explain the majority of the characteristics we find in the near-death experiences. Think back to the 12 I mentioned, or the 16 gradation scale. Thirdly, depersonalization is generally observed in women ages 15 to 30, and is reported as a dream-like state. They'll talk about it as being in almost like a dream. Again, this language of dream is not used by near-death experiencers. Also, near-death experiences are not relegated to a specific gender or age. It's cross-gender, cross-age. So let's turn now to the transcendental theories. So transcendental theories will of course argue that near-death experiences are evidence that the consciousness can exist outside the body. So basically, there is an afterlife, there is life after life. Dr. Long, in fact, proposes 9 proofs for the transcendental theory that we have an afterlife. His first proof is lucid death. Now, what he argues is persons who are, especially cardiac arrest patients, persons whose hearts have stopped, that we have evidence that they have flatlined, and there's no brain activity, or there's no discernible brain activity. They shouldn't be having these vivid experiences, yet they are. Many of these persons, are reputable people who have nothing to gain by making up this experience. In many cases, have much to lose. Including respect by their peers because they're being ostracized for having this strange experience. Yet they're coming out and saying this happened. Second, blind sight. This is pretty interesting. Specifically with respect to persons that have been blind from birth. So people that have no analogy for sight. For them, sight is an abstraction. Yet these people are reporting to be able to see after they have died. And in several instances, there have been a few studies that have recorded the accuracy of their sight. And so in some instances, not only are they able to, take for instance a blind person with an out-of-body experience, they'll not only talk about what everything else looks like around them, but they'll talk about themselves. So this is the first time they have seen themselves, and they'll describe themselves, accurately. Impossible conscious. In cases where amnesia has been used, in cases where an anesthetic has been used, there shouldn't be consciousness. Amnesia should result, yet we're having these vivid experiences. Perfect playback, we talked about this already. After decades of research on this topic, people that have had these experiences are able to recall them with perfect accuracy after many decades. Fifth, family reunion. Now, scholars are kind of puzzled as to why so many NDEers are encountering family members. And by the way, most persons that have a near-death experience encounter family members. if they're encountering family members, and if this is solely a function of the brain, then it would make sense that you'd be encountering persons that you've known for a while, people that are recent, persons that are within your short-term memory. Yet, and in fact, studies on hallucinations have found this to be the case. When you have an hallucination, it's very likely to encounter, when you're encountering persons in hallucination, persons that are recent to you or familiar to you. Yet, in many near-death experiences, the vast majority of the persons are long dead, and many of whom are unknown family members. So it's not uncommon for a person to meet someone that seems familiar and have no idea who they are, and then some years later, months later, weeks later, go through an old family album and find this person that they met in their experience, and lo and behold, that person is a great-great-grandmother. 6, children in NDEs, and we talked about this already. 7, worldwide consistency. And we talked about this already, but just to stress that when we look at the content of near-death experiences, they are similar cross-culture, cross-religion, cross-ethnicity. How do you explain that? By the way, the other theorists, in particularly the psychological explanations, they'll jump on the worldwide consistency and say, well, no, that this is evidence that this is a psychological issue, that when we fear death, this process kicks in to protect us from the trauma. Nevertheless, there is a worldwide consistency. Number 8, change lives. You don't find hallucinations changing people's lives. There really isn't, to my knowledge, any experience like a near-death experience, with the exception of religious experiences, that can create this 180, change in direction of life. People who have these experiences are by and large becoming more positive, more religious. They're looking for, or they have now, meaning in their life. They no longer fear death. How do you explain it? And by the way, even in negative NDEs, so people who have negative near-death experiences. So the one positive of a negative near-death experience is that people who come back from these experiences, they don't want to go to hell. They don't want to go into this. I don't know if you recall, but from my Christian lecture, when I spoke about hell, or at least hell in the Catholic conception today, this image of being alone is predominant. And this is what we're seeing in negative near-death experiences, this complete aloneness. You don't want that, right? So you come back from that experience and you're a better person. Finally, out-of-body experience. I mentioned this 214th, this recent study in October. There have been a few others, and certainly when we look at testimonies of families of attending nurses, in some cases, the attending doctors as well, when they're meeting with a patient that has just come out of their coma, or just been resuscitated, when that patient's able to talk, they'll vividly describe what has happened to them. This is a characteristic of out-of-body experiences. In fact, this is so common or so well known that the studies that have attempted to test out-of-body experiences, one of the ways in which they do this is they put up targets near the ceiling of these various emergency rooms. And the hope is that and the reason why they do this is because the only way you'll be able to see these targets is if you are at the ceiling level. Otherwise, they're relatively invisible. So, of course, if you're seeing these targets, then you must be having an out-of-body experience. Ergo, now we have evidence that out-of-body experience isn't something made up in the mind, but something that's really happening. So there is some evidence that at least in a few instances, out-of-body experiences have been verified as accurate accounts of what's going on. And so you're left with two options there. Either that person really did see the things he says he saw, which meant that the afterlife does exist, or someone fabricated something along the way. In the study that I mentioned, the 2014 study, Dr. Purnia was pretty careful in training the physicians and nurses with respect to keeping the confidentiality of all that's happened until the person or persons were interviewed. But nevertheless, it's good evidence for the existence of the soul or consciousness outside of the body. Nevertheless, there are problems with this theory. I personally believe that there's a good reason to believe that there's an afterlife based on near-death experiences. Is that proof, though? Do we have proof? Even Dr. Purnia, who wrote up or was one of the main authors of the awareness study, he doesn't go so far as to say this is proof of an afterlife. He points to the fact that although it's good evidence, it's reasonable. It may be reasonable to say there is an afterlife. Much more research is needed. And one of the main issues is the fact that only 2% of the people that he was studying had an out-of-body experience, and only one of them was able to recall the events, his recall was then proven to be completely accurate. So if you want to argue that he had an out-of-body experience, that the soul does exist, is it logical, is it reasonable to universalize that? And perhaps only he has a soul that exists. Maybe the rest of us do not. Remember that in the Egyptian religion, there was this belief that annihilation was possible. You may not have an afterlife. Maybe it's something like that. So even the scholars that have good evidence for near-death experiences, especially like Dr. Purnia, they're careful not to call it proof. But even someone like Dr. Long, who provides the 9 proofs, he himself personally believes that near-death experiences are evidence for an afterlife. But if you pay attention to how he words it, what he's going to say is it gives good reason to believe, right? He's not going to call it, or he rarely calls it a fact. Secondly, be aware that most scientists do not accept the transcendental theory. Now, many of whom are committed to materialism, so they're not open to anything that will contradict a biological explanation. And they'll point to the fact that the body is still a mystery. I mentioned this earlier in the lecture, that there's still debate as to whether or not the consciousness is caused by the brain. And for those who believe it is caused by the function of the brain, there's still debate as to how the brain creates consciousness. So these basic questions of what is consciousness are still debated, amongst scientists today. Nevertheless, because near-death experiences are so common, perhaps 1 out of 5, maybe 1 out of 4 persons who are facing deadly situations will have a near-death experience, it's important to be aware of them. And some of the new research out there, especially with respect to nursing or nursing theory, has to do with how to care for someone who's had a near-death experience. Susan Simpson is one of the leaders in this field, and she has a few points just to be aware of. So let's say you are a healthcare worker and you have a patient who has a near-death experience. What do? Well, number one, she argues, is you need to be informed. Okay. She says also be informed that studies have shown persons that have been resuscitated and have had a near-death experience or claim to have had a near-death experience will want to keep the light on. We'll talk about having a strange dream, appearing withdrawn or scared. And if you observe this, ask them, right? About their experience. In many cases, if they're saying these things, they're exhibiting this, they want to talk about something, and this can help with their recovery, just kind of getting this off their chest. At the same time, you do not want to be judgmental, even if you think the transcendental theories are not at all accurate. You're not convinced. For these people who have had these experiences, these are life-changing experiences. And if they're sharing this experience with you, take it as a compliment. I mean, that's evidence of your effective care. And so you want to be really careful on what you say and how you say things. Unfortunately, many near-death experiencers have reported that after sharing their near-death experiences, the nurses and doctors suspected them of psychosis, right? So they're sent to the psychologist. Now, at the same time, if you honestly suspect, what psychosis is, and you honestly suspect this person's suicidal, or you suspect psychosis, then of course you want to contact the appropriate medical professionals. But in many cases, all you need to do is just be there present to the person. But you want to do it in a non-threatening and non-judgmental manner, and that also means being aware of your verbal and nonverbal clues. Interesting enough, when I was speaking to a very close acquaintance who's a nurse, and I was asking about near-death experiences, she blew them off as it's just something that the brain does. Common, but it's just something crazy that the brain does when a person dies. You say that to someone who's had this experience, that could be detrimental. I mean, who knows the effects that could have on their recovery. I mean, that might lead to depression. So you want to be really careful on how you care for your patients. Some ways to help your patients is simply ask open-ended questions. Let them talk. Remember the first lecture I mentioned to you about effective care as proposed by Charles Core. What Charles Core argues is that when persons are asking you questions about the afterlife, what you believe about God, in the context of a patient and a healthcare professional, they're normally doing this just because they want a venue to voice their own opinions and concerns. And I think that's the case here, as well. So you want to be, supportive of that, discovery to the best of your ability. At the same time, just be mindful of overstimulation. You don't want to exhaust your patients, so just be careful with that. One technique to help your patients is to affirm that many people, which is absolutely true, also claim to have had similar experiences, right? I mean, if we're talking about 8% of the population, that's millions of persons that have claimed to have this similar experience. Just let them know that there's support out there. You might also note that, especially if you're working in a hospital, the people with the most experience and knowledge of near-death experiences are generally your chaplains. And especially if you're not comfortable, or even if you are comfortable, you might want to suggest that they or you contact on behalf of them the chaplain for them to speak to. There are a variety of near-death experience support groups, including the study that I mentioned by Dr. Long, the website you have at the beginning of the lecture, and you might want to give them this information if they are so interested. Well, with that ends our final discussion of near-death experience. Just make sure you do pay close attention to how we define it, the basic characteristics of it, and the arguments for and against them by those three different groups. You may see this on your final exam. Anyway, have a great and blessed day, and I wish you luck in the future. Goodbye.